Good evening, distinguished guests. It is with great pleasure that I stand for you here today. I want to thank the U.S. Embassy, especially the U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands, Mrs. Shivali Rasdandugal, and Mrs. Tracy Metz, the Director of the John Adams Institute, for the opportunity to welcome you on this very special evening. As Ian Kenny of the Adams Institute said, to set the tone for tonight. And so I will. But not before welcoming Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Mr. Lonnie Bunch. The NINSE staff, management, and board had the privilege of having an inspiring conversation this morning with you. Thank you again for that. And today, October the 18th, 1 year ago, I was in Ghana. I was there together with NINSE board member and Winter Priestess Marian Marklo to also visit Fort Elmina. And for those who do not know what Fort Elmina is, Fort Elmina was, in short, from 1637 onwards, the center of the trade in enslaved people for the WIC, the WIC. And the kidnapped enslaved people stayed here for 4 months before making the grueling journey across the transatlantic ocean. And through my mother's side of the family, I knew that one of my ancestors never made the journey. She had been kidnapped along with her 2 sisters and had been molested during those 4 months. And by the time the enslaved had to make their way to the waiting ship, she jumped overboard. I wanted to honor her too, even though I didn't know how. And to be honest, the prospect of visiting Fort Elmina was disturbing for me, because what would I feel? And what would it do to me? But before Marian Marklo and I went to Elmina, we went to Asin Manso. And Asin Manso is the former market for enslaved people, where they also had their last bath before moving to Fort Elmina, but also other places. And they didn't know that they would never return. A sad place. But Marian Marklo has been visiting Ghana for 40 years. And in that time, she developed a water ritual for descendants who visit Asin Manso. And I also did that ritual. And while performing that ritual, my mood changed from sad to strong. Because while I was performing, and it was a ritual that lasted 1 hour, I realized that my ancestors returned. And they returned because I was there. And I was there because despite everything they had developed, despite everything, they had developed the strength to hold their own. They had developed the strength to be human. They had developed the strength so I would be there. And I don't think I need to tell you how I ultimately experienced Elmina. There was nothing left of my sadness and maybe fear, only the strength to face the past and continue today and in the future. It is this legacy of the ancestors that served as an inspiration for the title of the report that NINSE produced 2019 in the context of the exploration of the Slavery Museum, the power of the ancestors. And in that context, it was reassuring to hear Secretary Lonnie Bunch say this morning, and I will paraphrase, that cultural institutions have the obligation to make a country better, and that it is important to make the importance of African culture transparent for the Netherlands, also through a slavery museum. And that is exactly what the founding mothers and fathers of NINSE intended 20 years ago. An institute on the transatlantic slavery past with a transatlantic slavery museum as one of the important pillars. A museum that promotes the revaluation of African identity, the recognition of the power of the ancestors, the impact of slavery past in the present in various ways, but also expresses everything that embodies Black excellence. And I must say, in this month of Black excellence, it's very important to talk about the Slavery Museum. And it's not for nothing, all with the aim of achieving healing and cultural reparations. Because at NINSE we say that 400 years of slavery has had impact, and that it's time to repair everything on social, economic, and cultural basis. So this could be a start. And in that sense, the development of this museum is in itself part of the revaluation of African identity, with room for the African voice. Because how can there be healing and cultural reparation if the promise to the founding fathers and mothers of NINSE, who represent the African community in Suriname, the Caribbean part of the kingdom, and the Netherlands, is not fulfilled? With respect to the Secretary's words that cultural institutions have the obligation to make a country better, I think that this museum can become a best practice of how to validate the needs, wishes of the community of descendants or people from the African diaspora in Holland. And it may be the elephant in the room, because in spite of all everything that has been achieved from the apologies from the Prime Minister and the King, we see that, and we all know the examples where when our community is trying to organize commemorations or build monuments, that she is confronted with the fact that there is no room for only the African perspective. That is something that we have to learn in this kingdom. And that's why we say it's part of the transformation we have to have. And we always see that when one wants to focus on the African perspective, not to exclude, but to give it a place, one is accused of not being inclusive enough. When in fact, there is a need for an African perspective if we want to build and serve this lovely nation we're living in. Including the African perspective is necessary to write our new history together, not for ourselves, but for everybody else, all the youngsters that come after us. My name is Linda Nooitmeer. I'm the chair of NINSE, the Dutch Institute on Slavery and its Heritage. And I wish you a very pleasant evening.
Of course, the first thing you have to do is pay attention that you're not going to stumble on this. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Good. Okay, because I'm not sure. I go through this mic? Yes. Okay, good, good. So, welcome, everybody. My name is Ronald Leopold. I'm the Executive Director of the Anne Frank House, a little bit down the road here. And first and foremost, thank you so much, Linda, for your very powerful and moving words. Giving a wonderful introduction to the evening and to the program of this evening. You were talking about experiences that can make us better citizens, a better world. a better country. And it's my pleasure and honor tonight to moderate this evening, this program, introducing our esteemed guest of tonight. I may do this on behalf of this wonderful institute, the John Adams Institute, talking about becoming a better citizen. I don't know how many of you are a member of the John Adams Institute, but that would be an easy first step to become a better citizen. So please.
We're not paying you for this, are we?
I know. I know. It's for the same pleasure I'm saying all these words, Tracy. So, when I had a meeting with the staff of the John Adams Institute a few weeks ago to prepare for the evening tonight, that's weird. We go through what we are going to discuss tonight and how the program would look like, and then someone sends you the run of show of the night, and it says in this program that you have 5 minutes to introduce the guest, and it makes sense. It sounds very reasonable until you start to do some research on the guest, and you think, oh my goodness, if I should give this man a proper introduction, we'll still be here at midnight. It's something that I think an endless row of achievements, positions, curator, member of boards, member of committees, director, now of course the director of, I think it's the biggest museum in the world, the Smithsonian. I mean, the umbrella of the museums. And now I have to grab for my glasses that I need since 1 year. Screen. Numerous important positions: educator, historian, curator, director, board member, member of committees, author, among many other publications of this wonderful book. I'm so happy. I just got a copy from Secretary Bunch, because to be very honest, I admit I bought a Kindle edition, so I could only show you my iPad. But now I know, and please, I can strongly recommend this wonderful book, also in light, of course, of what we're going to discuss tonight. And on top of this all, Secretary Bunch is a loving husband and father to 2 daughters, and maybe some of you will know that being a parent of 2 teenage daughters is a full-time job in its own right. And you wonder, sometimes you meet with people and you think, how is it that some people can put 48 hours in a day, 2 years in 1 year? How is that possible? So I can only mention some of the highlights. Curator, historian of the California African American Museum, National Museum of American History, Chicago Historical Society, and of course, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I had the privilege to visit that museum a month after the opening, and to be very honest, I was completely blown away. And I was thinking, I know 1 or 2 things as the director of the Anne Frank House about the emotional impact of places, of museums, but this was a very, very different experience. I don't know how many of you had the privilege or the possibility to visit a museum, but if not, please go there, and please go there many times, because I don't know how many times you would need in order to take in all these stories, histories, experiences, voices, contributions. It's a marvelous, marvelous place. Of course, since 2019, Secretary Bunch, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian. And I was wondering whether, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that later on in our conversation, if you sometimes in your office look out over the mall from the castle, I think it's the castle that you mentioned, right? From the castle, and you think about that backyard in Belleville, New Jersey, where you grew up as a black kid in a predominantly white neighborhood. And that's the story of a life, the story of an incredible life, the story of someone who contributed to his community, to a country, and I would say to mankind. So I could go on and on and on. I'm not going to do this. 5 minutes? Please join me in welcoming the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch. Yes, thanks.
I was worried for a minute he was going to tell you everything about me other than I was president of my third grade class 2 years in a row. There's hope for everybody.
Someone was really moderating Wikipedia probably and skipped this part of the biography. Maybe we could start. I had the privilege of welcoming Mr. Bunch, Secretary Bunch, Lonnie, as I may say now, on Monday at the Anne Frank House. So perhaps we can start our conversation going back to Belleville, New Jersey. Growing up, I just mentioned, as a black kid in a predominantly white neighborhood, the third Lonnie Bunch, with namesakes that inspired you. Could you tell us a little bit of how that was in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Belleville, New Jersey?
Well, I grew up in a town that, by the time I was growing up, was overwhelmingly Sicilian. So I grew up speaking Sicilian and English. I can still curse in Sicilian with the best of them. But the most important part of growing up was recognizing that as the black kid in the neighborhood, there were people that treated me wonderfully and people that treated me horribly. And I remember so powerfully a moment when I began to ask myself, why does race matter so much? I was playing basketball in the backyard with a bunch of kids in a house I didn't know, and the mother saw we were out playing ball, and she brought out the drink of the day, which was Kool-Aid. She brought out Kool-Aid for everybody. And then she saw me and said, "Oh no, you drink out of the hose." And I'll never forget the pain of that, of sort of being different and being treated unfairly. So for me, what that neighborhood taught me was I wanted to understand why. So first it was reading books, learning history about the community, because I thought that might help me understand myself. But then ultimately, it turned out that history became not just the way I understood myself, but it became my weapon in the struggle for fairness and freedom. So that neighborhood, which was really, a wonderful neighborhood if you weren't African American, it really shaped who I am. And it taught me that there were people that were so good and so kind, and people that were so mean. So it taught me never generalize, work with the best, and try to use what you do to make sure that nobody ever felt the unfairness I felt at that moment.
I can imagine after an experience like this, you turn to your parent and you say, "What's going on here?" What was their answer? So how did they try to raise you in such an environment?
Well, the good news is I was raised by two educators, so there was nothing but desire to read and learn and understand. But my father grew up in the same neighborhood in the 30s, and he was the only black kid. So when I'd come home and say, "Oh my God, this is horrible, guess what they did to me?" And he said, "You should have been there in 1939. So I didn't get all the support you might want, but what you got was the support to say that you use education as a way to transform yourself, and then by doing that, you make a commitment to transforming a nation. So in my house, the most important things were education and fighting for fairness.
Talking about family, your grandfather, the three your namesakes, was it an inspiration for you? Could you share your experiences? Sure. Could they help you in growing up in these environments? And tell us a little bit maybe about the family background.
So I'm Lonnie III, and Lonnie I began life as a sharecropper and decided that that wasn't the future for him. So he ended up finding a black college and went to college at night for 10 years. He graduated, decided he wanted to be a dentist. So he saved his money, went to Howard University and HBCU, graduated in 1916, and said, I'm going to New Jersey to be a dentist. Well, in New Jersey, the state said, you got a degree from a black college. That doesn't count. So what he said was, where's the best dental school in America? They said, University of Chicago. He went to dental school twice. He came back in 1919 and said, now what are you going to do? They said, well, welcome Dr. Bunch. And he practiced for almost 40 years. But the problem is, when you have a grandfather like that, on the one hand, you learn how a single person can transform a family's trajectory. But on the other hand, it's like with my father. Anything that was a problem, he'd say, I went to dental school twice. So there wasn't an opportunity for pity, right? But I think what was so powerful to me is that Doc died the day before I turned 5. Everybody called him Doc, Uncle Doc, and he turned the day before I turned 5. And what I remember most is that he used to read to me. And one day he was reading a book and it had pictures of school children, roughly my age. It was a book from the 19th century. And he said, look at those children. Isn't it a shame? They live their lives, they're probably all dead, and all it says under the caption is unidentified. And he said to me, it is wrong that people can live their lives and all it says is unidentified. And even though I didn't know it, that set me on a path of saying, how do I make visible the invisible? How do I give voice to the anonymous? So that moment is so with me because I realized I wanted to know who they were. And that began a sort of lifelong looking at photographs and documents, trying to understand how people live their lives and what lessons I could draw from that.
Was it a family of storytellers?
My father was a scientist, so there wasn't much, it was sort of like, do your math homework. But I think that the storytelling came from my mother's family, and they were very Southern, and so whenever we'd visit, they would tell stories about family life. But I think for me, I didn't discover storytellers, so I started reading history. And as I read history, I suddenly realized that history is about amazing stories. And so I lived my young years trying to hear stories, learn stories, and then begin to share those stories.
And did you find those stories in the books?
Not really. I mean, I started like most kids of my age. You're reading the biography of George Washington or somebody that invented the sewing machine. And it really wasn't until I got to high school that there were books that reflected the African American experience. And the only book we had in the house was a book by the great historian John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom. And so I read that cover to cover, understanding those stories. But basically, it wasn't until high school that you really began to see a few publications that you could read, that you could learn a little bit about race and yourself.
Passion for history was there at a very early age?
There's nothing more I love than history. Forgive the American analogy, the New York Yankees, a baseball team.
No Red Sox fans here?
God, better not be. But, so it really was, history really was the thing that allowed me to both get lessons in life, but also escape the neighborhood.
We only have 40 minutes, so I have to make a huge leap towards what eventually became the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I was struck by the words of Linda in your introduction, Linda, when you mentioned that in the process of the National Slavery Museum is so important in its own right, that it's already transformative that it's already, in a way, contributing to this re-evaluation that you so powerfully explained to us in a minute ago. Now, talking about a process, here was a process. You were the director of the Museum of No.
That's right.
There was no money, there was no site, there was no building, there was no collection, and there was no staff except for you and your assistant.
And one other person.
A long shot, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of my great strengths is I'm not smart enough to know what I can't do. And so basically what I realized is that this desire to build a museum had been floating around for 100 years. I mean, it began in 1915, and there was great fear on my part. How did I think I could do it? I mean, I almost didn't take the job because I thought, come on, you know, who am I? And what I was struck by, though, was that there was this great passion in people like Congressman John Lewis, the great civil rights leader. But as I began to go around the country and talk to people, there was this sense of, oh my God, these are important stories. Can you make sure they're being told? And when you start with a small staff, it gives you an opportunity to dream, to imagine, to strategize. So we spent a lot of time, as the staff slowly went from 2 to 8 to 10, thinking about reimagining what a museum could be. My commitment from the very beginning was I was not interested in building a museum. I could do that, but I didn't know how to build an institution that could transform a community, a nation. That's what I wanted to do. And as I told people who came to work for me, this is about the greater good. If you're willing to enter into sort of this darkness of not knowing what will happen, but believing that what you can do is really an institution that can help America grapple with its tortured racial past, but also help America understand that this is not a story of Black people by Black people, that the story of Black America is too important just to be in the hands of Black America. It is the story that profoundly shapes who America is. When you think about American core values of spirituality, resiliency, optimism, where better to look than the African American community? And when you look at a group of people who believed in an America that didn't believe in them, who basically said, we will live our lives to help America live up to its stated ideals, who helped people realize that in many ways, protest is the highest form of patriotism. So for me, it was all of that gave us the sort of strength and desire to move forward. But the most important part of the process was realizing that it was going to be a decade before you'd have a building. So I thought, if it is just a project, who's going to believe? So what I said is, from the very beginning, we're a museum, we just don't have a building. We crafted exhibitions, educational programs, wrote books, brought scholars in, and basically used that to model what I expected and to demonstrate to not just Congress, but the provincial funders, look how good we are and we don't have a building. Give me some money, and boy, oh boy, will we be able to really hit a home run.
And then one evening, you were not watching the New York Yankees, you were watching the Antique Roadshow.
Well, no. One evening I fell asleep in front of the television. And when I woke up, the Antique Roadshow was on. And I didn't know what it was, but I thought, what a good idea, let me steal it. So I basically created something called Saving African American Treasures, where we went around the country and asked people to bring out their collections. But it wasn't to collect them, it wasn't to take them. It was really, I was thinking, how do I demonstrate that a museum is of value in non-traditional ways? And I thought, why don't we bring conservators and help people preserve grandma's old shawl or that 19th century photograph? And that's what we did. And of course, by doing that, people then said, wait a minute, we'd like to give this to you. And what we did is that we often said, you've got amazing stories and amazing material, give it to local museums. I didn't want it to seem that the Smithsonian was going to take everything. But if it was really significant, we took it. And what was so powerful was that we built a collection of over 40,000 artifacts, of which 70% came out of basements, trunks, and attics of people's homes. So for me, it changed exactly the way museums can collect. And it really gave us the most amazing collections because people trusted the Smithsonian, and people knew that this was a story that maybe only the Smithsonian can tell in that way. And so they trusted us. And I tell one story.
Yeah. Oh, please
Tell one.
tell many.
No, one story. So we would go to these cities, and then, what would happen is people would show up, but then the next day it would be in the newspaper. So somebody would call. So I was in Philadelphia, and a man called, and he said, listen, I have material from Harriet Tubman, the great abolitionist, this amazing story. And I said to him, no, you don't. Nobody's got material from Harriet Tubman, come on. And he said, well, at least, it's a 2-hour drive to Philadelphia. And so I did, and this guy who had it was this huge guy. He was like 6'4", 300 pounds, and he came and he had this little box. And he pulled out the box and he opened it, and there were photographs of Harriet Tubman's funeral in 1913. And I gasped, and he said, oh, you like it? And he hit me. It hurt like hell. He pulled out 33 objects, and every time he hit me. So by the end of the evening, I'm crying. Now I know from the pain or from the amazing material he pulled out. He pulled out the hymnal. Harriet Tubman used to sing spirituals to alert the enslaved that it was time to leave. He pulled out her hymnal that had, Steal Away Jesus, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And then I realized that I don't have any money. This is worth millions of dollars. So I said to him finally, sort of timidly, what's it going to take for this to come to the Smithsonian? And he said, shake my hand. And that was it. I realized that the generosity of the American public, the generosity of the African American community is why we were able to build such a rich collection. So literally, though my arm ached, my heart was filled by what he gave us.
Yeah. Amazing story. This applause is also for the man who gave it to you.
Charles Blockson, who just died within the last month.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
But an amazing man who basically changed. He made me believe I knew we could find artifacts. I didn't know if we could find treasures. He made me believe we could find treasures. Excuse me? Well, he was known by many people as a collector of books. So Harriet Tubman's great-great-great-grandniece, who was on her deathbed, said, what am I going to do with this box of material? And that was the only name she knew, so she called him. And she said, do something with it. And he could have sold it, he could have given it to local libraries, but he really felt that the Smithsonian was the place where more people would engage with it and it could have the most transformative effect. So that's how we got it.
You will have the opportunity to ask some questions after the program. 3 questions. The problem is if you moderate an evening with a man like Lonnie Bunch, who is so focused on engaging audiences, it's not always easy to stop the engagement, let me put it like that. And that would be my next question, because I think the stories you just told us were not just about building a collection. It was also very much about creating a public engagement and creating a public engagement around a museum that has become a landmark, not just in America, I can say. Is that public engagement, was that part of the strategy? Also looking again at your question of how important the process in itself should be for creating a museum, carving a museum that finally should become a landmark also in this country.
Part of the strategy was recognizing that building a museum was like building a political campaign. Mm-hmm. That part of what you needed was constant visibility. So we created a strategy, I called it a campaign of visibility, so that whenever we got a collection like that, I made sure the press covered it. Then I convinced National Public Radio, one of the most important operatives in the United States, I said, why don't you every week come to my office and we'll talk about an object we found. And that got people, people would call me, when can I come to the museum? In 8 years. But it really got people excited about what we could do. So that notion of visibility, of making sure that we would be in places where the public would know that we're there. And then the other piece was really recognizing that what I needed was to take advantage of some of the people who were already excited about the museum. So one of the great supporters was Oprah Winfrey. So I just would go into meetings and Oh, I was talking to Oprah, and that would sort of get people. Or when Barack Obama became president, who was a friend of mine from Chicago, we'd have these meetings about, we can't do this. The Smithsonian can't move this quickly, and I'd say, I was talking to the president today, and he mentioned it. So I'm shameless, I admit it.
But you did not just talk to Oprah and the president. You also talked at a certain time in your life when you took a trip into the South with a man, I think his name was Princey Jenkins. And
Yeah.
he was in a way transformative for you and for, I think, the process that later on became the museum.
I mean, why I love history is that I have these moments where it changed my life. I was trying to find a cabin of the enslaved. And I went all over the country looking for cabins. And I ended up near a rice plantation in South Carolina. And I turned down this dirt road, and there were 5 cabins from the 1840s and 50s still standing. And next to one of the cabins was a man named Princey Jenkins. He was 92 years old, and he had lived in the cabin with his enslaved grandmother. So you could see, for a historian, this is the Holy Grail. Somebody who could tell me these stories. And he was amazing. He talked about how his enslaved ancestors used a broom to do what he called a hard sweep in front of the cabin to extend their living space so there'd be no grass. He talked about, what the role of the children were watching the chimney, or what food his ancestors grew behind the house. And we went to the fourth side, or rather I went to the fourth side, and he didn't come. And I'm thinking, I'm a young scholar, thinking, oh, there's got to be something really powerful here. And I said, what happened over here? He said, I'm not going over there. And I said, why? He said, because there's nothing but rattlesnakes over there. So after I stopped running, I asked him, why didn't you tell me? And he said something that has changed my life. He said, people used to remember, now they forget. And if you're a real historian, I'm not even sure what you do, but maybe your job is to help people remember not just what they want, but what they need to remember. And that changed the way we looked at the museum. It was both a place to understand what the public wanted, but to also use scholarship and our own creativity to say, but here's what you need. And that tension between want and need made a different kind of process and a different kind of institution.
I could imagine that the question, who decides of what we need to remember, is something that takes centerpiece in the museum, in the staff, in society at large.
I mean, I think there was a lot of debates within the staff as the staff grew, and I always made sure that we had a scholarly advisory body who would sort of help shape all those discussions. And then we had a variety of community scholars, local librarians, et cetera, who made sure we understood their point of view. And then I spent 2 years doing surveys around the country, getting an understanding of what they knew, and then rather than simply say, here's what they want, we really looked at, for example, one of the big debates was, what's the role of slavery in a museum? The number one issue that people didn't want us to talk about was slavery. And the number one issue they wanted us to talk about was slavery. So in my mind, that meant we needed to privilege the story of the enslavement. So we basically said, let us now use our own judgment, our own scholarship to make certain decisions. But we always wanted to know what the public wanted, what their expectations were, and that was always part of the consideration as we shape what the museum would do. The goal was to say, has to be a museum that will make you cry as you ponder the pain of slavery and segregation, but it also had to be a museum that would allow you to find joy and resiliency. It would allow you to tap your toes to Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, or somebody from the hip-hop world. I had no idea who it would be, but the goal was
Your daughters
pain,
would...
and my daughters would know,
Yeah.
pain, but joy, and resiliency.
The Holocaust Museum is right around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of building the museum, someone said, you should out-Holocaust the Holocaust Museum, tell them what they did to us. Mm-hmm. And you were opposing that voice. Can you tell us why?
I think that my goal was to craft a museum that defined reality and still gave hope. And I never wanted to ever water down the pain of slavery and the impact of slavery. But I also recognize that it's a story of slavery and freedom. And I wanted to make sure that this was not trying to simply say this was a Holocaust that someone did to us. Rather, I wanted to say that what you want to privilege is people's ability to survive, people's ability to believe in themselves, people's ability. I mean, what I really find the most fascinating thing about studying slavery is how did people on plantations in the middle of nowhere believe that there would be a better day? And that belief, not for them, not even for their kids, maybe not even for their grandchildren, that belief was so powerful to me that I wanted to make sure that belief never got overwhelmed by anything else. So the notion of trying to, again, my favorite word is tension. The tension between the pain of slavery, tension between the impact of slavery on a broader society, and the desire coming out of slavery to change America and to be a place that is more ripe with freedom was really what motivated us.
A little bit of shop talk, perhaps, if you allow us. Designing a museum that goes from pain to hope. What is in between?
What is in between is the process of transformation. What's in between is really trying to say, how did you get from A to Z? And to recognize that to understand that, you've got to understand everything from the role that culture played as both a bulwark to protect, but also as a way to sort of change a society. What's the role that activism played? What's the role, how did African Americans prove they were worthy of citizenship? Kind of inventiveness and creativity. So it really was trying to say that while slavery and freedom were really sort of key points of the museum, the key is how did people believe and help America be the America that they wanted, not necessarily that everybody wanted. And so I think that was part of the challenge. And then working with designers, geez.
Where's the aspirin?
I think the great strength is, and this is the only thing I will say that I know how to do. When I first curated exhibitions and worked with designers, anything they put on paper, I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And then when you see it, you're like, that's not what I wanted. So I had learned enough to be able to sort of work with designers to make sure that it fulfilled our dreams. And we made sure that we hired designers that were in their 20s and 30s. I wanted that vision. I didn't want what we traditionally did. And I wanted to make sure that the museum was designed in part to elicit emotion, to make sure that this was not a static exhibition that you could graze through, but something that humanized history and made you care, regardless of who you were, care passionately about who these individuals were and what their lives were about. And so I think that was, we worked with designers to try to accomplish that.
When I try to remember my mindset when I visited the museum, I did visit twice. I vividly remember that.
You got in tickets? I'm impressed.
You know, we knew some people on your staff, actually. It's always a risky thing to tell and to share with the public, because sometimes I tell people, you know, I have the key to the back door of the Anne Frank house, and don't say it to anyone because it's impossible to, as you know, it's impossible to get tickets, and it's pretty much the same, especially the first time, especially in October, shortly after the opening. And I was very lucky to know one of the people on your staff, Paul Codillo. You have been working with him closely. That's not what I wanted to ask, and that's not what I wanted to tell you. What I wanted to ask is actually my memory of those visits were very compelling, also because, I mean, you come from the basement, you come from these lower floors, and you're choking. You can't breathe from the pain and the loss and everything that's there. And you need a little bit of space, and you need a little bit of time, and you need a little bit of food, and you need a drink in order to open up to the message of hope and the message of freedom. It's impossible to connect those two things in a more immediate way. How can you tell us a little bit of that process of, you know, how to design the museum in that sense? Not.
I mean, we did something I've never done in all the exhibitions I've curated in my career, I never gave you a forced march. I never said, this is the path you follow. But I felt it was so important to privilege the enslavement story, and that to give you a sense of the congestion and the tightness. But what was really important to me was finding relics of a slave ship. And that's really what we wanted to find, relics. Not a slave, because I thought, when I started the process, I said, oh, that can't be hard. There's got to be slave ships I can find somewhere. I didn't realize that almost every slave vessel is underwater. So I had to create a whole project of underwater archaeology, bringing together scholars, divers from around the world, and we searched the world for ships. I thought I found one off the coast of Matanzas in Cuba. I spent 2 years negotiating with the Castros. It's a good thing I'm not a diplomat, because that didn't work. But we found a ship that I had taught in South Africa in the 90s, and some of my students were saying, we think we have a slave ship that sank off the coast of Cape Town. It turned out it was the São José, a ship that left Lisbon in 1792, went all the way to Mozambique, was on its way to the New World when it sank. Half of the, quote, cargo was lost, the other half was sold the next day. So we found the ship, began to bring up pieces, but I realized that I couldn't tell that story if I didn't go to Mozambique. So I went to Mozambique and met with the Makua people. They were 512 of their people on the ship. And two things happened that I'll never forget. A young woman in her 20s comes up to me and says, I want to thank you, because every day in my family, we say the name of our relative who was on that ship. This is hundreds of years later, every day. And that the fact that you found that ship, you helped us find our ancestors. And then the chief said to me, I have a gift for you. He gave me a vessel wrapped with cowrie shells. And I opened it and it was just full of soil. And I said, what's the gift? He said, my ancestors have asked that you take this and sprinkle it over the site of the wreck. So for the first time since 1793, my people can sleep in their own land. So for me, I just thought, this taught me this is more than a museum. This is more than a research effort. This is really transformative. And to finish that story, we decided to do that in Cape Town at Camps Bay. And the day we did it, we were going to take the sand out, and it was a horrible day. It was like the day the boat sank, candidly. The wind was blowing in against the rocks. We struggled to get out. We had to swim out. We couldn't even get a boat out. We swam out, and the moment the soil was turned over, the sun shone out. And I said, never mess with your ancestors, because that's what they did. So for me, this became a much more of a spiritual journey. Not much more. It became a scholarly journey, a spiritual journey, and a personal journey.
Like the journey you made, Linda. We need to talk a little bit about politics.
I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Maybe not politics, but you had a strong belief that the African American experience could be a key to a better understanding of what it means to be an American. Mm-hmm. It should be key to a better understanding of what it means to be a human being. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very compelling and defining point if you want to build a museum, and probably much more than a museum. Mm-hmm. It's could you tell us a little bit about your vision on this? So, and what exactly were the elements of African American history and culture that you consider to be a key to a better understanding of ourselves?
I always thought that I learned in graduate school that it was just as hard to write a book about something big as it was to write a book about something small. And I thought, if we're going to do a museum, let's make it the best we can do. Let's really push the parameters. And I thought that because the Smithsonian is the Smithsonian, that millions of people will come grapple with things in the Smithsonian that they won't in other places. I said, how do we take advantage of that? And then I realized we're going to be on the National Mall, between the Capitol and the White House, to be the place where the world comes to understand America. How do we take advantage of that? And I thought that the way to take advantage of it is to say, here's how America was changed, was made better, was pushed by this community. And so really thinking throughout all the work we did, how do you make sure that people understand what this community really means to defining America? Scholars have argued that almost every moment where America was made better in terms of freedom and fairness was tied to African Americans. And so I wanted people to see this was their story, whether it was exploring how after slavery so many of the enslaved fought for education in the South and how that fight led to public education for whites as well. So to help people see how this has shaped them all. But the goal was that if this was just a really good museum, I didn't want to do it. If it was something that could be part of the contributing factor, to help people define reality and still find hope, that's what I wanted to do.
And how does that work out in a divided country as the US nowadays?
Well, thank God I opened 7 years ago. But
We come to talk about Donald Trump in a minute. So.
But I think that museums at their best can be the glue that holds nations together. And that I really felt that even in a contested time, we were able to get people of very different points of view to come into the museum and ask themselves questions about what is it that makes you an American? What is it that allows you to be better than others? What is it that allows you to find, and the way I framed it was that I wasn't asking, I was doing what African Americans ask, which is simply saying, live up to the promises you made in your Constitution. And so that's why we felt that people, even in a partisan time, begin to see that. And what we found is that because 45% of the audience was not African American, we found exchanges and interaction among people who basically said that they went through a museum and they were changed. And that's what I wanted.
Beautiful. You mentioned storytelling, and storytelling also is a powerful instrument for museums, increasingly so. Mm-hmm. It's not undisputed to present history by storytelling. Depends on the stories you tell, the voices you put into your museum. It has the risk of history becoming very from one perspective, from the perspective. I know from the Holocaust museums that it's always difficult to make a choice between the kind of voices that you present in your museum. So at the same time, it's a great way to humanize what has been dehumanized.
I mean, that's really the key, right? The key was let us bring the scholarship to frame all these voices, but if you go through the museum, you understand the history through those that lived it, through those that experienced. And we really said, as scholars, shape it, but I want to see the words. I want to see the stories of other people, and that's what we did. And so here's my second name drop. This is what Oprah Winfrey taught me. We would meet every month, and she would say, the most important thing is telling good stories and thinking about how those stories are shaped by scholarship. So every time I met her, before I asked her for money, I'd listen and say, help me understand about storytelling. And so I think we really felt that whatever the risk, storytelling allowed us to humanize this history. It allowed us to give voice to the very people who are anonymous. And if you walk through the museum, the design, most of the images are at human scale, at eye level, so that you don't look down or look up, but you see them as peers in a way.
Very true. I'm looking at the clock. I know.
I'll shut up when you tell me. So.
No, please, no. Tracy used to be the one who was telling me.
Keep going, you're doing a good job.
Good. Maybe we can slowly shift our talk also to what is going on in our country. You have met with people here over the last couple of days. And we will talk about that a little later on in the panel with Linda and with Valika. But are there any, you have traveled a lot, you have seen many places, you have seen many museums. What could be in your view, how could the museums serve as an example to other countries, for example, our country, in your mind? I mean, what are the elements that are not specific American and that are more generic for museums in other countries?
I mean, I think that many countries have elements that are asking, what does their history mean? The Portuguese grapple with their involvement in the slave trade, or should grapple more with their involvement. And I think that what my sense is that always think about the cultural institution that you're creating as both driven by the subject, but driven by the possibility of helping a nation understand itself better. And I think that while museums can't solve all the problems of the world, what museums can do is provide contextualization of who you are today, and by dipping into that reservoir of the past, really begin to ask fundamental questions about who you want to be as a nation. And I think that it's really important. I've always been struck by how much we learn from a nation by what it remembers, right? By what it builds museums for, what it puts on the walls of its museum, what are monuments and holidays. But I think you learn even more by what they forget. What is left out because of fear, a lack of understanding. And I think that in some ways, nations that don't grapple with their history are only incomplete, really do not understand the fullness of who they are, and therefore cannot really reach all the expectations that they should have. Now, this is said by a historian, okay, but I just think that I really believe that so strongly. And I spend a lot of time traveling, sort of helping nations, challenging nations, pleading nations to really think about how their history really is framing who they are today. And by understanding that history, you can then make some of the changes that need to be made.
We talked a lot about museums, of course, as you're not just a historian, but also a curator and let's say, a museum man. But coming to grips with a painful past, with a violent past, with the past, colonial past, takes place in a much broader context than just a museum can present. It's much more than we all put it into a museum and that's it, and go to the museum and, you know, like a laundry, you come out of the museum and you have come to terms with that past. What are the elements in the American society that you think are important for that broader approach?
I mean, I think part of it is really recognizing the visibility that you can use in a museum to sort of challenge a culture to wrestle with these issues. It's really part of an overarching strategy of, you know, whether it's writing op-eds, doing books, I've got filmmakers doing different kinds of films to be able to convey these issues. So think of all the tools that you can have as a cultural institution to begin to shape these issues. And that's what we just try to do. I can't say that everything is transformative, but everything is trying to lead to that greater understanding by embracing your history.
Commemorations?
Commemorations are always good, as long as the other side of the coin is the reality of what you're not commemorating. Yeah, when they run me out of the country, like, will you give me a job, just in case I may need a job here, right?
Okay, for the people who are the quartermakers of the National Slavery Museum, if you have any vacancies, you know who to call. A Fool's Errand. It looked hopeless, and you thought, why am I doing this? Some people here in the audience might think the same. What's the message? What's the errand?
Well, I mean, the message is, the notion of a fool's errand to me comes from a 19th century American novel. And it's about a person who goes to the South to help transform the newly enslaved, and he fails. But he says, a fool's errand is really the best errand you can have, because it is saying, I will do something noble, important, to change a country. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, even though I told the public, oh, piece of cake, we got it, I worried about failure. But I worried about it not because people would say, see, you guys couldn't do what you said you'd do, but that I wanted people to realize that the effort to craft this, to change a country, to illuminate all the dark corners, was worth everything you could do. And so that's why I took that title of the book as saying, it was a fool's errand, but boy, if that's a fool's errand, let me be a fool every day.
Maybe we can end this part of the evening, this conversation on how should I put it, on a more juicy note, a juicy anecdote, perhaps.
You got me scared. I'm not sure where you're going, but was there a chapter in the book I missed?
I already said. I think we come to talk about Donald Trump.
Oh. Okay. Oh, you want to talk about Donald Trump?
I think there was a visit.
Yeah, so what happened is that the museum opened basically a few weeks before the election where Donald Trump was elected. And I gave Donald Trump a tour of the museum because I felt that my job is to educate everyone, right?
Very true.
And so when we were about to begin the tour, there were people on his staff who said to me, whatever you do, don't show him anything difficult. So I said, absolutely, I will follow your directive. And so I took him down to slavery. And what was so interesting was there were moments where I saw what I thought was real engagement. We were talking about the Netherlands, that we have a piece where we talk about the number of enslaved people that the Dutch brought to the New World, and he's nodding, and I'm thinking, this is amazing, we're gonna really get to this important subject. And when I stopped, he basically said, hey Lonnie, they love me in the Netherlands. So I walked fast through the rest of the tour. But the point is, though, that what's important is while that was a moment that was really painful on so many levels, it was also, though, important to really take somebody who didn't believe in the story that they were seeing and grapple with it as they walked through. And my sense is that I bet he had a different view of some of the things than he did before.
Absolutely. Transformative for everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
May I invite you to the...
Hey, you want me to go here?
Yes. And could I ask you to sit? Because there is no microphone. And please, Linda and Valika, may I invite you to the...
You want me here?
Okay. Yes, please, take a seat here. Can I serve you some water?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Okay. Well, anyway, so it's... Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, it's on y'all.
Excited.
I'm done.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna watch you now.
Okay. Good. Okay. The tech is good? Sound is good? Yes? Okay. So we continue the program with a panel with two other esteemed guests that I'd like to introduce to you. On my far right is Valika Smulders, head of the History Department of the Rijksmuseum. Yes, please. You have fans in the audience.
It's the museum.
It's the museum. Well, we come to talk about that. And then, as you know, Linda Nooitmeer, chair of the board of NINSE, the National Institute for Netherlands, for the Dutch Slavery, History, and Heritage. Yes. So it's wonderful to have a follow-up on the conversation we just had with Secretary Bunch and see how the relevance of the experience of building the maybe not just the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but maybe also including your current position and responsibility as Secretary of the Smithsonian's, because I think one of the elements that we have to take into account now is also what kind of museum landscape do we have in the Netherlands, and what is that landscape? What is its relevance for the let's say the journey that we are making right now? This evening was being announced as a people's story, a nation's journey. This nation is in a journey, I think. And perhaps, if I may start with you, Linda, what are your thoughts about that journey that the Netherlands is making right now? Where do we stand, and especially where do we stand in light of what you just heard from Secretary Bunch in terms of the long way that we still have to go?
I think that you said correct, the long way we have to go. I think that nobody can deny the Dutch slave history, especially since the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, where suddenly there was some kind of sense in Holland that, okay, we have a slave history, and there's something we have to do about it, and it lasted 400 years. And let's talk about it, etc., etc. So we have made developments, definitely. I can't deny that, also with the apologies from the Prime Minister and the King, on the role the Dutch government had in during slavery. But on a day-to-day basis, what we see as NINSE is that we have a long way to go, because, and maybe it's not that it's logical. If you have 400-year history that was never talked about, you can't even find enough details in books, school books, in education, Dutch education, then how will people know? So I think, and there are developments in it, but I still think that the fact that Holland, the Netherlands, we haven't found a way to really start the conversation about this history and its impact, and that's why it's for NINSE so important not only to talk about commemorations, but also to talk about the impact. Because the impact is a day-to-day experiences that people of African descent have in the Dutch Caribbean, in Suriname and Holland. So, a long answer to your question, where are we now? I think we are at the beginning. And sometimes it depends in which bubble you're living in. But if you look at the whole, I still think that we have a long way to go, and that's why I always said in my speech right now that the progress of transformation is about recognizing the voices, the wishes of the community of descendants, and as long as we can see that in our country. If you talk about education, if you talk about job opportunities, if you talk about ability for housing, if whatever you want to talk about, if you look at Holland as a whole, on the surface there is a lot going on, but the core of real equality, especially for people of African descent, we are not yet there.
It's always difficult to make comparisons in terms of learning from the past, and all those differences and a handful of similarities. Same goes for the comparison between countries. But what could we, on this journey, learn from the American experience? What could we learn from the experience Secretary Bunch was just talked about in terms of for example, could a museum give a huge boost to the process you just described that is a little slow, if I may say so?
Yes, I believe so, and that's why I said that it should be a best practice of how you give voice to the needs of the community. And I think what we can learn from the United States is the engagement of the population, of the community. I think that's very important.
And do you have the community, what community do you have in mind? Because it was so powerful from Secretary Bunch to say that it's actually engaging the country.
Exactly, it is engaging the country, but I think it also starts with engaging the people of African descent in the Caribbean part of Holland, in Suriname, and in Holland itself. Because what we can't forget is that the system of slavery was planted in the Caribbean part of Holland and Suriname. And those structures of slavery, they still exist. So we need intervention from within from within the country to make sure that people can engage. But even now, the ability to engage is sometimes a luxury. So as long as we haven't made sure that people can have the luxury to engage and are not surviving, then it will never come.
Right.
And maybe the long history, because Suriname will have its independence next year, 50 years, and you have parts of the Caribbean part of Holland that are still not independent. So that's the difference. But I think we can learn, and if we want to come to the transformation, and that's why we say at NINSE, even after especially after the apologies, what we first want to focus on is the impact of slave history on the lives of people. We are satisfied when the most vulnerable person of African descent in the Dutch part of Holland, the Korean part of Holland, in Suriname and in Holland is served with this process, and then we can then people have the luxury to do more, and we're not there yet at all.
Valika, doing more, representative of that classic institution, the Rijksmuseum, playing such an important role in the nation building of the Netherlands in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in such a different phase in that nation's journey. What could be the role of the Rijksmuseum on this journey? How do you see that? What have you done so far on this journey? Could you share a little bit of that? I know it's a very general question, so please feel free
really
to.
Broad, and I really recognize what you say, that you are talking about such a broad scope, and what museums can do is much smaller. But what we are doing at a pace that is going faster and faster is that we are bringing down the walls of the museum. Museums used to be very elite institutions. It used to be something that was visited by people with a higher education, who had the means to go visiting other museums and other countries as a tourist. So those were the people who would largely go to museums. And what we started doing at the Rijksmuseum 6 years ago, when we started with the whole idea of building an exhibition on slavery, is to bring down those walls, to bring in people on the work floor that have a connection to this history. I was one of those people, and we have pledged that in the coming years we will continue to do that. By 2025 we want 25% of our work floor to be of non-Western descent. So we are committed to really bringing change, and we do that by also committing to new networks, working with other museums in other countries, working with people here in the Netherlands from all different kinds of backgrounds, talking differently about our collection. So we brought in oral history as a source. We tried to go as far back as we could. We used recordings of people who lived history, who talked about their ancestors. So by using those recordings, we were able to go back into the 18th century and have people talk about the lived experience, to really go into the minds of the people who were enslaved themselves. And that way, we made the collection we have, which is a very old-fashioned collection, which is very much built on power and wealth. we made it relevant for a much larger group because we discovered that there's all kinds of connections to people who were enslaved, people who fled slavery, people who revolted against the system. So by doing that, we are trying to be a museum that is much more for a broader audience, for many more different kinds of groups in the Netherlands, to be a complete history and a complete country we are speaking to.
I think you also want to show an example of that in terms of a painting, I think.
Oh, that's a different kind of example, but we can bring it in because it is it is a painting we are so proud of at the Rijksmuseum. And actually, I wanted to bring this in because I really wanted to ask Secretary Bunch to reflect on this. Because what we did during the slavery exhibition is speak about the slavery past, the colonial past. But what we really want to do moving forward is to speak about much more than that. And this painting, maybe we could make him a little larger, Lika? This painting is of a man, Christopher de Moor, who was working here in Antwerp, which was then part of the Netherlands, in 1525. This is 100 years before we even started the West India Company, before the East India Company was started. So this means there's other ways of looking at the Netherlands, looking at asking questions about what's our identity, who built this nation. So what I'm curious about is, you come from the US, which is what we called back then here the New World. This is the old world we are sitting in. How do we reimagine the old world? Not as a white space, but as a space that was much more than we used to write about.
I mean, I think that the work that you've done, the work that other scholars are doing, are basically putting color back into our national identity. And I think in some ways, it really then makes more complicated the story of slavery, right? And that's good, because I think that, you know, the notion is, how do people make a way out of no way? How did this man make a way that said he definitely wasn't of the community, but he became the community? And so I think that for me, what that allows you to do is really make a richer story, a more complex story, and a story that says it doesn't necessarily start with slavery.
No.
It starts with identity, it starts with freedom, it starts with opportunity, and then you layer on enslavement and other stories. So I think this is really very powerful, and it really is this way of sort of, you know, shining the light on the darker corners that were always there, we just didn't know.
Yeah.
So I want to be you when I grow up.
Really, do you, now that you're the leader of the castle, the lord of the castle,
Oh, don't go there.
do you miss the curating part?
Of course.
Are you envying them?
Well, I mean, I think
Envying
that
her?
if you're a historian, you write. If you're a curator, you curate exhibitions. So you have to find ways to fulfill that part of who you are. So for me, being able to lead an organization that, with the right guidance, is really that gift to America to understand climate change, or understand space, or understanding the sort of challenge of diversity within a nation like the United States, that fulfills some of my soul. But as long as I can find ways to write, or cause trouble, or get a chance to be in groups like this, that nurtures the rest of my soul.
You're representing two different parts of this journey. And probably we all need each other. So I was just wondering, how does that work? I mean, do you find each other easily? Is there any overall strategy in terms of how this journey should look like? Or is it just we all do our own thing within the walls of, or within the organizations that we're working on? I mean, is there, How does it work?
I can say that, especially with the last exhibition, slavery exhibition, I think that was a very good way. It was the start of the Netherlands taking part, of being a part of that history. So I was really inspired by that. And because of the fact that in 2013, when we celebrated the 140th and 150th abolition of slavery in the Dutch Caribbean in Suriname, the Rijksmuseum opened for the first time after a long renovation. And we were told, there were a lot of movies and etc., and documentaries, and we were told that this would be this is new. And I expected that if the 17th century would have a big part in this museum, that the other coin of history would be presented.
Of that century.
Exactly, but it wasn't the case. So I was really disappointed, because I thought, even with a commemoration of 140 years of the abolition of slavery, there is still no knowledge about this history. And then it was really comforting also, and hopeful that 10 years later, we had the exhibition in the Rijksmuseum, and that was really on point. It's very difficult, I think, to make an exhibition of 400 years of Dutch slave history. But the elements that were chosen, they told the story. So we were really inspired. And it also helped us, and we know each other. I mean, Holland is small. So we know each other, but it is really inspiring to see museums, other people in Holland doing their own thing, and that help us in our struggle, in our journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big steps that we have been taking these last few years is to bring together different types of organizations, different types. I mean, the activists are joining the historians and are shaking things up and are reminding us of our responsibilities. We are triggered to do research with sources that we've never used before. So bringing together, when you were talking, for example, about your family history that you've been searching into, when you bring together what people have at their homes, and then you bring in the archives, and you bring in the visual collections that we have, and everything together speaks about so much more than we could ever do. And just last week I was at this starting moment for a new group that's going to do research into the royal family and their connections to slavery. And for the first time, so many historians came together that said, I've never done anything with colonial history before, because I always thought that it was a separate type of history. And now we see that if you bring everything together, there's so much more you can speak about. So we are making huge steps by looking each other up, by coming together and doing that work. But we need to keep on doing that. And in that respect, I'm a little bit jealous about the US and about the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian soon 23 museums.
Oh, please, don't give me too many.
But the good thing about that is that you hold on to each other. You come together. You have a vision for the complete field. But here we have more than 400 museums. We look each other up, but we are also very caught up in our own agendas. So how do we hold on to each other and see to it that we do not segregate into our own agendas? How do we see to it that we don't?
Before getting to the collaboration part of the museum landscape within the country, and you don't need to tell us everything, but can you tell us a little bit about what it meant for the Rijksmuseum to go from 2010 to 2020? I mean, from the exhibition Linda mentioned first to second. I mean, the transformation within the institution. the process of change, of innovation, of opening
I
up.
was there for a little part of it. Linda was there for another part of it because she used to work at the Rijksmuseum as well. But there's somebody here in the audience that can really help us take a look behind the scenes, and that is Ida Douche, because she followed the whole process of making the exhibition of slavery. And she was there also in the moments when we thought, oh, please don't film this, because we were anxious about the whole process and felt insecure about what we were doing, but we also felt really comfortable in the hands of Ida, so we knew that she would do a great job and she would never embarrass us. Mm-hmm. So she filmed that whole process, and you can still follow that on television, I think. You can watch, what's it called, NPO Gemist. So she took us, through her film you can see that what was really at the core was talking. Because without talking a lot, you don't have the same frames of reference, we haven't read the same books, we haven't lived the same experiences, so you need to talk about that.
But was there a common sense of urgency? And you don't need to tell us everything.
I think for some people it was more urgent than for other people, but by working on it as an organization, there's 900 people working at the Rijksmuseum, and it became something of all those 900 people. And I mean, there were departments, the Department of Security, for example, that's where most of the people of color were. For them it was different than for the curators who were doing the historical research. And
were they the
we got
trailblazers?
Together and we talked about it, and we got the networks of all the friends of the museums together, and we talked about how we were changing terminology, for example. And they weren't on the same page all of the time, but that's not important. The important thing is that you do look each other in the eye and work on it. And
was there at a
that
certain...
was anymore, it was privileged to be able to do that.
Sure. Was there at a certain point of time also maybe the ambition of this should be part of the Rijksmuseum? This should be part of us? I mean, the history of slavery, presenting the history of slavery, presenting such a huge part of our history. I mean, if this is an institution that was, you know, played such an important role in building the nation, I mean, we're talking about what was not being remembered and was left out. Was there any, at any point, the idea of not doing separate museums? I will ask the same
question, because yes, it is hugely important that as the National Museum, slavery should be something that we address on a daily basis. So we are working on our permanent collection, addressing slavery as much as we can. But the collection is an old-fashioned collection. It is not able to speak about the stories of the people who lived through it on a daily basis. So what Linda said earlier, that the Slavery Museum should be the best in its field in speaking about the lived experience, we are absolutely behind that. And I think one of the things that we were not able to dive into in depth in the slavery exhibition at the Rijksmuseum is racism, and the way that that was seminal to the whole system. So we should talk about that. All school classes should see that at the Slavery Museum, because that should be broken open, that whole discussion. About 10 years ago, racism was a word that we would hardly speak about in museums. And that has to change. And that's the package that the Slavery Museum is taking with it.
Secretary Bunch, I think when 1916, the first idea of
1915.
1915. You also worked at the Museum of American History, the National Museum of American History, but finally it became a separate museum for as a National Museum of African American History and Culture. Was there at any point of time the idea of including that into the broader history, or was it from the very beginning the idea of having a specific...
You know, I think there were, at various stages in the history of the 20th century, there were discussions about that, but there was also fear. There was a major controversy at the Smithsonian in 1963. They wanted to open a major exhibition on the civil rights movement, and the Smithsonian thought Martin Luther King was too radical to be in the Smithsonian. So, so the challenge really was not so much that you create a separate museum because it's a separate story, but the realization that no single museum can contain all of American history. And that why I felt it was important to do it at the Smithsonian is because at its best, the Smithsonian used different portals, different doors into what it means to be an American. You can go through the American History Museum. You can go through the technology of the Air and Space Museum. You can go through the Native American Museum. So that the key is that each of those are about a separate story, but those stories all point us to the question of who we are as Americans. And that's why I was very comfortable with crafting a different kind of museum to be part of the Smithsonian.
As part of the whole.
Yep.
As part of the main, right. I'm afraid we run out of time because we could continue this conversation until midnight, but, but unfortunately. So thank you very much, Monica Smulders. Thank you very much, Linda Nooitmeer. And yes, of course, yes. But I would like to, okay, I can shift that to first questions. We have time for 3 questions. And I emphasize the word questions because I know this is always a very emotional topic that we all like to express our thoughts and feelings about, but I would really like you to invite and to encourage you to ask questions. I have 1 question over here, 2 questions, and and 7 questions over there. Let's start over there, and then I come to you, Hala, and then I come to you, sir. Good. Okay, please.
Dr. Bunch, Secretary Bunch. I had a question, I wrote it down, I wanted to make sure I got it right. We have book bannings in America. We have cancellation of African American studies in different universities. We have critical race theory being tossed to the side. And it's being demonized. You spoke earlier about what is needed in museums and also what we want in museums. Can you speak a little bit about where you think we are headed and how can we resist those sorts of activities that are trying to marginalize those what I think are important discussions and topics about history?
I think it's important for cultural institutions, for historians, for universities to make the argument why history matters, why it's important to grapple with questions of African American history and culture. For me, I'm proud that the African American Museum will be there as long as there's an America, so it will be a counter narrative to whatever is being said. But I really do think that, like so much in the United States, it's about, can you marshal support? Can you make sure that you are politically enough, strong enough to be able to sort of counter that? And so, in essence, while it is important for us to make the argument, it's also important to recognize that this is a part of a broader political, cultural war, and that if you're in a cultural fight, you gotta fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they are gonna run me out at some point, but you know.
Hala, please. Could you bring the mic to home, please?
Thank you so much. 2 quick questions, you can answer one or both. You talk a lot about storytelling, all of you. I haven't heard much talk about writers, and I was wondering what, if any, role the writers, such as in Isabel Wilkerson, or the British, now American writer Sarah Ladipo Manyika, who just did a beautiful collection of interviews and essays on the African diaspora. What role do writers have to play in helping fill in those stories? And the other part of the question, and Ronald, you alluded to it at the beginning, to what extent might there be cross-fertilization, support, learning between other groups, the Holocaust Museum, the Jewish community, the indigenous populations, you talk about the Native American Museum, they're all part of this fabric, but the groups that each have had such a very difficult, long, painful history and growth with steps back, big steps back and steps forward. What can these groups and institutions learn from each other?
They're already working together in the States, I will say that. I don't, there, you know, there's an international group called Sites of Conscience that are museums that explore a variety of issues, some painful, and so these groups work together to basically share information, to support each other, to do exhibitions together. So there's always more that can be done, but I really think that those conversations are occurring. And I guess the first part of the question was? Writers. So one of the things I'm proudest of is in the African American Museum, you see the voice, the words of writers everywhere. Because my sense is that to tell this story, it's a story told through film. It's a story told through amazing writers, and then it's really using writers who are now wrestling with contemporary issues or historical issues. So there's an amazing array of programs where writers come and give presentations at the museum. The same thing with new films. A lot of the premieres of films happen at the Smithsonian. So it really is a part of saying, what are the voices we need to hear? And writers are crucially important. One of the things I love the most is in the museum there is a space that we were called a kind of memorial space where water is flowing down, but there are only 4 quotations, 3 from writers. And so really making sure people can walk in, be washed anew with the water and washed anew with the quotations.
Any remarks from your Felica or Linda? Anything to add to?
I think that because she asked it earlier, I think that we have to strategize more in Holland, basically I think that also because of the fact that, and you said it already, everybody is in its own corner, and sometimes it also has to do with finance, but we have a lot of stories which align, even if you're from the indigenous population or the Maroons, there are stories alike, and we could collaborate more. We're trying that. Those are baby steps, yes, I believe that we're getting there, and that people also see the relevance of that. It's not about being separated or fight against each other, but go for the common goal. And I've always said, why do we have to have one slavery museum if we're talking about that museum in which there's a little part for everybody? Why not have 5, 6, 7 museums in which all those stories, all those legacies can be seen and can be spoken about? It's like the Dutch dish hutspot. You put everything together and you have a sauce on it. I think if we want to build this country, we have to give worth to all those different communities with their legacies and their stories. So we're getting there.
Please allow me a short notion, perhaps regarding your question about the network of Holocaust, Jewish communities, and the topic we were discussing today. I think also following up on this notion that Secretary Bunch saying this was not a black museum for the black community, and I feel that it's a very strong notion that the memory of the Holocaust and commemorating the victims should not just be the responsibility of the victims. And I think that notion is also very true for what we were discussing today. And there's one more question for you, sir.
You spoke a little bit about stories and heroes, and in the U.S. there's a big history of creating these new heroes, right? The American pantheon, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, etc., etc. How can we create and mainstream new heroes? What have you learned that can help us here in the Netherlands doing it? And for the Dutch, both Valika and Linda, how can we develop and mainstream new heroes that tell a story of also all of our people that make it mainstream in our society? How can we do that? Do we have any visions and perspectives?
You guys are the experts.
Well, if I could start with Tula, for example, I'm so thrilled as a Curaçaoan that we had Tula in the exhibition, that he has now been rehabilitated. Difficult word in English. I think since the last revision of the canon, the historical canon, we have added Anton de Kom, and now every Dutch person knows Anton de Kom. Tula is next. And if I can tell you a little secret, just last week we bought a new aquarelle at the Rijksmuseum, which is of one of the first people who was an activist on the labor front in the 20th century in the Netherlands, and she's a Dutch woman, black woman. So we are creating these new heroes every day, and I think in a few years we will have a canon that is much more filled with new heroes that we didn't know before, but that we'll get to know in the future.
Well, my idea of those, as I said earlier, why do we have one slavery museum and why not 5, 6, 7 that contains all of the legacies? Because I also think that if there is the recognition of on all those different communities we have in Holland, then the stories, but also the heroes, we need to know all the heroes that exist within the communities that live in Holland. So for me, it's like we start with this museum, and in about 5, 10 years, we have more, and a general idea that being Dutch means that you not only have notion for the Dutch culture, but every culture we have in this country, and we also have to start with it. If you look at Lindsay, started from within the community who wanted more recognition. I think that we have a lot of very strong communities in this country who can do the same, and then we can build it ourselves. I really believe, and I believe in the collaboration, because we don't have to start all over again. We can definitely support each other in that phase.
I think on this very optimistic note, hopeful note, and hopefully a very realistic note, I would like to thank you, Valika Smulders, thank you, Linda Nooitmeer, and of course thank you, Secretary Bunch, for this wonderful evening. Thank you for your attendance, and I would like to, please stay here, I mean, paying attention to the panel and to the Secretary, because it's my pleasure and honor to announce the next part of the program, which is the Ambassador of the United States of America, Shefali Razandugal. Take a seat. Should we? No, we just. Oh. I'm sorry, Shefali. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Ronald, Linda, Valika, and Secretary Bunch, for the inspiring discussion. My name is Shefali Razandugal, the United States Ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It is a privilege to be here this evening with all of you. I would like to extend a special thank you to Tracy, Ian, Mika, and all of our friends at the John Adams Institute for making this evening both possible and a success. The John Adams Institute is a trusted and longtime partner of the U.S. mission to the Netherlands. Tonight's program is an example of the valuable contribution the John Adams Institute makes to the United States' most long-term diplomatic relationship, the Netherlands. The John Adams Institute provides an independent platform for American culture in the Netherlands. The Institute brings the people of our two countries together to discuss the most pressing issues of our time. Thank you. The subject of tonight's discussion is vital to the Biden-Harris administration, to the United States mission to the Netherlands, and to me personally. I am the first person of color to serve as the United States ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I am an immigrant to the United States, raised by a single mom who worked 2 minimum wage jobs to support us. Mummy was a seamstress during the day, and she cut vegetables at the local grocery store in the evening. For various and often unkind reasons, I have been made to feel many, many times in my life as if I were insignificant, as if my voice and my story did not matter. I spend a lot of time thinking about racism and sexism, and about the history of colonialism. I have always been extremely cognizant of that history, as it is often taught it is very incomplete. Realities have been left out. Stories about people who lacked power, people who were oppressed or enslaved, people who were female, people who lived on the margins of society. When we teach history without these very real perspectives, we perpetuate the lie that their existence made no significant contribution to the present, that their lives did not matter. My dear friend, Secretary Lonnie G. Bunch III, has been exposing that insidious lie through his work as a historian. As the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and for the past 4 years as the United States Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Thanks to his inspiring and fearless leadership, more people are able to accurately discern when a false and frankly romanticized historic account of the United States is being espoused. Women, immigrants, indentured servants, refugees, Africans who survived the brutality of slavery, and many others built, ground up, the United States into the country that it is today. Our collective history is the history of the United States. We matter, and we belong. The work of Secretary Bunch is central to the democratic process. We must take into consideration the views, contributions, and talents of all the different types of people that make our democracy so strong. The United States still struggles to make our institutions truly representative of the American people, although we are trying. We must consistently and conscientiously make an effort to bring to life our democratic ideals. American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, statesman, and former slave, Frederick Douglass, taught us this when he said in 1857, "Without a struggle, there can be no progress." Democracy is hard, purposeful work and the United States and the Netherlands are true friends committed to stepping forward and stepping together towards the light, towards accomplishing the hard work together. Secretary Bunch's visit now, as the Netherlands commemorates the abolition of slavery, is not a coincidence. The United States and the Netherlands share much of this violent and sinful chapter in history. To illustrate, the first slave ship to arrive to the United States in Virginia in 1619 was a Dutch ship. Secretary Bunch's visit at this historic moment publicly demonstrates the willingness of the United States to participate in honest, difficult conversations about the truly painful parts of our shared history. The scholar and trailblazer Philomena Essed revised Frederick Douglass's words when she wrote, "Without pain, there can be no progress." Thank you, Secretary Bunch, from the bottom of my heart, for leading the American people to confront our past in hope of a better United States for all, for the present and certainly for the future. Thank you for sharing our struggle with our true friend, the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for your for your very kind words. And thank you also to the U.S. Embassy and Black Achievement Month as our partner in making this event happen. I'm Tracy, that's the one you just heard the ambassador speak about, the director of the John Adams Institute. I think some really memorable things have been said this evening. And the one that will really sit with me forever now is that we need to tell people not what they want to remember, but what they need to remember. Thank you, Secretary Bunch, for planting that in our minds as we move forward in this often difficult, but now very topical, and I think increasingly open conversation. Linda said we haven't found a way in the Netherlands really to start this conversation yet. We're at the beginning and we still have a long way to go. But at the same time, I take heart from what Lonnie G said. We're putting color back into our national identity. And that is in the US and that is also here. It is high time. We have a long way to go, but it's happening. As Lonnie said, we are now shining a light on the darker corners. And as the ambassador said, we're trying. I think we're making progress. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Fanika. Thank you, Linda. Thank you to our moderator, Ronald Leopold. And thank you above all to Secretary Lonnie Bunch for your presence and your inspiration. Thank you.